A former Navy SEAL didn't come to this town to start over. He came to disappear, carrying war inside him and silence around him. He rented a cheap house near the forest, next to an abandoned place everyone whispered about, a house they swore was haunted. He didn't believe in ghosts, not after what he'd seen in real wars. But his dog did something strange every night. At exactly the same hour, the German Shepherd would stand guard, ears raised, eyes locked on the darkness, refusing to rest. No barking, no panic. Just the quiet warning of a dog who sensed something deeply wrong. What began as rumors and fear would soon become a test of loyalty, courage, and a truth someone was willing to kill for. Before the story continues, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, like, subscribe, and stay with Silent Paws Steady Hearts. Ethan Cross left California before sunrise, not because he was in a hurry, but because daylight made memories louder. The highway was empty, the kind of emptiness that felt earned rather than accidental, and the pale blue of early morning pressed gently against the windshield like a promise that nothing would demand anything from him for a while. 40 years old, former Navy SEAL, medically discharged and spiritually unmoored, Ethan drove north with no music, no destination he felt attached to, and no intention of explaining himself to anyone ever again. 3 nights earlier, a flash of brake lights on Interstate 5 had pulled him out of a dissociative spiral, just seconds before his truck would have plowed into stopped traffic. He still remembered the sound his own breath had made afterward, sharp, animal, unfamiliar. The VA doctor called it a PTSD episode, manageable with time and structure. Ethan called it proof that he no longer trusted himself around people. He didn't want a fresh start. Fresh starts required hope. What he wanted was erasure, a place quiet enough that his past would lose interest in following him. The town he chose barely registered on most maps. Nestled against the edge of dense Oregon forest, it was the kind of place people passed through on their way to somewhere else. One main road, a diner with flickering neon, houses spaced far enough apart that neighbors didn't pretend to be friends. When Ethan stepped into the small real estate office, the woman behind the desk, Sarah Whitcomb, looked up with polite surprise, as if she hadn't expected a customer at all that week. Sarah was in her early 50s, tall and slightly stooped, with ash blonde hair pulled into a loose bun that suggested she'd stopped trying to impress anyone years ago. Her skin was pale and freckled, her eyes sharp in the way of someone who noticed details for a living. She spoke gently but directly, and when Ethan said he wanted something quiet, cheap and isolated, she hesitated just long enough to signal that she already knew which property he meant. "There is one place," she said, fingers tapping once against the desk, "but I should warn you." The house sat at the edge of town, backed by forest on 2 sides and bordered on the third by a structure no one had lived in for over a decade. The abandoned house leaned slightly inward, its windows dark and opaque with dust, its porch sagging like an exhausted spine. Sarah explained the rumors without drama. Lights turning on by themselves, sounds at night, animals refusing to go near it. She didn't say the word haunted, but she didn't have to. Ethan could hear it in the careful way she phrased her sentences, in the way she avoided looking at the property photos too closely. Most people would have walked away. Ethan signed the lease the same afternoon. Abandoned places had never frightened him. In Afghanistan, ruins had been sanctuary. Concrete shells and collapsed buildings offered cover, silence, predictability. It was living people, unpredictable, loud, full of expectations that made his chest tighten. The house itself was simple. Weathered wood, a narrow porch, enough space for one man and one dog. That suited him fine. The dog, Shadow, explored the property methodically while Ethan unloaded the truck. A German Shepherd, 6 or 7 years old, large and powerfully built, Shadow moved with the quiet confidence of an animal that knew exactly what it was capable of. His coat was thick and close, black across the back and shoulders, fading into warm tan along his legs and chest. His ears stood tall and alert, catching sounds Ethan couldn't, and his amber-brown eyes missed nothing. Shadow had been a K9 once, trained for detection and patrol, and though his muzzle had begun to gray slightly, his instincts remained razor-sharp. As evening fell, the forest exhaled. Wind moved through pine needles like a low, continuous breath. Ethan sat on the porch steps, elbows resting on his knees, watching the shadows lengthen. For the first time in weeks, the noise inside his head dulled to something manageable. He allowed himself to believe he might sleep. Shadow didn't. The dog stood at the edge of the porch, body rigid, ears fully erect. His gaze was fixed not on the tree line, but on the abandoned house next door. He did not bark. He did not growl loudly. Instead, a low, controlled rumble vibrated deep in his chest, the kind of sound that came not from fear, but from recognition. Ethan was on his feet instantly. He followed Shadow's line of sight, scanning the darkened windows, the sagging porch, the overgrown yard. Nothing moved. No light, no sound. Still, Shadow did not relax. His tail was low but steady. His weight shifted forward, muscles coiled but restrained. "There's nothing there," Ethan murmured, though he wasn't entirely sure why he said it. Shadow did not look back at him. Ethan knew that sound. He'd heard it in compounds before raids, in the seconds before something unseen revealed itself. Shadow wasn't reacting to wildlife. He wasn't reacting to noise. He was reacting to presence. The night passed without incident, but sleep came in fragments. At exactly 2:17 a.m., Ethan woke to the weight of Shadow's body pressing firmly against his chest, a technique the dog had used countless times during Ethan's worst nights. Shadow's breathing was steady, but his ears were angled toward the wall they shared with the neighboring property. When Ethan finally drifted back into unconsciousness, it was with the unsettling sense that something nearby was listening. Morning brought fog and the distant sound of logging trucks. Ethan walked into town for supplies and coffee, passing a small cluster of houses where an elderly woman sat on her porch feeding stray cats. She was thin, wrapped in a faded cardigan despite the mild weather, her silver hair cropped short and practical. She nodded at Ethan as he passed, her expression open but observant. "You moved into Miller's old place," she said. Not quite a question. Ethan stopped. "That obvious?" She smiled faintly. "Nothing stays unnoticed here for long. I'm Irene Holloway." There was no suspicion in her tone, only quiet curiosity. When Ethan mentioned the house next door, her mouth tightened. "Best to leave that place alone," she said. "Some things are safer when they're forgotten." Shadow, standing beside Ethan, watched her carefully. When Irene reached out, he allowed her to touch his head, accepting the gesture without enthusiasm. It was enough to tell Ethan she meant no harm. That night, the rehook came without warning. Rain began just after midnight, heavy and insistent, drumming against the roof and soaking into the ground. At 2:17 a.m., Shadow jolted awake with a sharp intake of breath, his body tensing in a way Ethan hadn't seen since active duty. The low growl returned, deeper this time, edged with urgency. Shadow moved toward the back of the house, nails clicking softly against the floor, stopping at the wall closest to the abandoned property. Then he did something unexpected. Shadow sat. Perfect posture, ears forward, head tilted slightly, as if listening to something just beyond human perception. His growl stopped, replaced by a quiet, focused stillness that made Ethan's skin prickle. This wasn't defense. It was alert. Assessment. From outside, carried faintly through the rain, came a sound that did not belong to the forest. A dull metallic thud. Then silence. Ethan stood in the darkness, heart pounding, every instinct screaming awake. Whatever was in that house was not a story. It was not a ghost. It was someone who didn't want to be found, and Shadow knew it. The man who had come here to disappear realized, with a quiet certainty that settled deep in his bones, that disappearance was no longer an option. The second night in the house felt quieter than the first, and that was what unsettled Ethan the most. Silence, when it came too easily, had always meant preparation. He lay on his back staring at the ceiling, counting breaths, listening to the forest settle into its nocturnal rhythm. Crickets, distant wind through fir branches, the low creak of wood as the house cooled. Shadow lay beside the bed, his broad back rising and falling steadily, close enough that Ethan could feel the dog's warmth through the thin blanket. At exactly 2:17 a.m., Shadow moved, not abruptly, not with panic, but with precision. The German Shepherd rose onto the bed and placed the full weight of his chest squarely on Ethan's sternum, pinning him gently but firmly. It was an old tactic, drilled into him years ago during long nights overseas, when Ethan's heart had raced him awake from nightmares. Pressure grounding, presence over noise. Shadow's muzzle hovered inches from Ethan's face, his breath slow and controlled, his eyes reflecting a vigilance that had nothing to do with dreams. Ethan was awake instantly. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not sit up. He trusted the dog. Shadow wasn't alarmed. He was alert. Ethan turned his head slightly and followed Shadow's gaze toward the wall that separated his house from the abandoned one next door. There was nothing to see, but that didn't matter. Shadow's ears were angled forward, body rigid, attention narrowed to a single point beyond wood and plaster. When Ethan exhaled slowly, Shadow did not relax. The message was clear: stay awake. This became their rhythm. Night after night, Shadow woke Ethan at 2:17, never earlier, never later. Each time the same posture, the same pressure, the same focused stillness. Ethan began to log the pattern the way he once logged patrol routes, writing observations in a small notebook he kept by the bed. On the third night, he noticed something new. When Shadow climbed down from the bed, he paced toward the back of the house, stopping near the bathroom wall. Ethan followed, standing barefoot on cold floorboards, listening. The toilet tank emitted a soft, hollow echo, the kind that came from recent use. Ethan lifted the lid and stared. The water level was lower than it should have been. "There's no power," he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. The house had been vacant for weeks before he arrived. He hadn't used the bathroom since the previous evening. Shadow sniffed the air near the floor drain, nose wrinkling slightly. The scent there was wrong. Not fresh, not threatening, old, human, weak. Over the next few nights, Ethan noticed more inconsistencies. Once, while sitting on the porch just after dusk, he caught a faint flicker of light through the grimy window of the abandoned house. It vanished before he could blink twice. Another time, he woke to the smell of damp fabric and unwashed skin drifting through the open window, carried on a breeze that should have smelled of pine and rain. It was the scent of someone who had been hiding for a long time. Ethan did not confront the house. Not yet. Instead, he watched. He listened. He let Shadow lead. During the day, Ethan settled into a routine that required minimal interaction. He fixed loose boards, cleared brush, and took long walks along the edge of the forest with Shadow at his side. The dog moved differently now, less relaxed than he had been during their first evening. His head stayed higher, ears scanning constantly. When they passed the abandoned house, Shadow slowed, placing himself subtly between Ethan and the property, a living barrier that needed no command. One afternoon, Ethan encountered Irene Holloway again. She was kneeling in her yard, setting out bowls of water and dry food for the feral cats that gathered near her porch. Up close, Ethan noticed the deep lines around her eyes and mouth, the kind carved by years of quiet endurance rather than hardship alone. Her hands trembled slightly as she stood, but her gaze remained sharp. "You look tired," she said simply. Ethan shrugged. "New place." She studied him for a moment, then glanced toward the abandoned house. "That place has a way of stealing sleep," she said, "even from people who don't believe in stories." She told him about the fire, years back. Not a dramatic blaze, just enough smoke and damage to force the previous occupants out. A young couple, quiet, private. Afterward, there had been noises at night. Footsteps, thumps beneath the ground. Folks assumed animals at first, then something worse. Eventually, the rumors did what rumors always did. They filled in the blanks with fear. "I don't think it's haunted," Irene said, lowering her voice. "But I do think someone wanted it empty." Shadow stood beside Ethan, watching Irene with calm attention. When she reached down to scratch behind his ears, he allowed it, leaning into her hand just enough to show acceptance. Ethan noticed that she smelled faintly of cat food and lavender soap. Harmless things. Shadow agreed. That night, the rehook came quietly. It was just past midnight when Ethan heard it. A low, muffled sound beneath the rain. Not metallic this time, organic. A cough, quickly stifled, drifting through the darkness from the direction of the abandoned house. Ethan froze, heart hammering. He hadn't imagined it. Shadow's head snapped up, ears rigid, eyes locked on the back window. The dog did not growl. Instead, Shadow moved to the door and sat. Perfect posture again. Calm, focused, waiting. Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. This was no longer about warning. This was acknowledgement. Whatever, or whoever, was out there, Shadow had recognized it as human, vulnerable, and close enough to hear. Ethan opened the door and stepped onto the porch, rain soaking his shoulders instantly. The abandoned house loomed beside him, dark and silent. He stood there for a long moment, listening, every sense stretched thin. Nothing else moved. The cough did not repeat. When he went back inside, Shadow followed, but the dog positioned himself facing the shared wall, lying down with his head resting on his paws, eyes still open. He did not sleep for the rest of the night. By the fifth night, Ethan stopped questioning the pattern. He trusted it. At 2:17, Shadow woke him. Ethan dressed quietly, moving through the house with the practiced economy of someone who had once survived on far less sleep. He checked windows, listened at walls, followed Shadow's movements as the dog led him to the back corner of the property. That was when Ethan noticed the basement door. It was partially hidden behind overgrown ivy and rusted lawn equipment, its metal surface corroded and streaked with age. The lock was intact, heavy-duty, far more secure than the rest of the house warranted. Shadow approached it slowly, sniffing along the edges, tail still, body tense. Ethan knelt, running his fingers over the cold metal. This door had been used recently. Not often, but carefully. The hinges bore faint scratches where something had been moved aside and replaced. Someone had gone to great lengths to remain unseen. Shadow pressed his shoulder lightly against Ethan's arm, a gesture that carried no fear, only intent. Ethan understood then what Shadow had been trying to tell him since the first night. This was not an intruder scouting targets. This was not a threat waiting to strike. This was a person hiding in plain sight, relying on neglect and superstition to survive. Ethan straightened slowly, rain dripping from his hair, the weight of the realization settling heavy in his chest. He had come here to disappear, to avoid the gravity of other people's lives. Instead, something unseen had pulled him back into orbit. He rested his hand on Shadow's broad neck, feeling the steady strength there, the quiet certainty. "Someone's down there," he said softly. Shadow did not look away from the door. He already knew. The storm arrived without warning, rolling down from the mountains like a living thing. Rain slammed against the roof in dense sheets. Wind rattled the trees until they groaned, and thunder cracked so close that the windows shuddered in their frames. It was the kind of night that swallowed sound and distorted distance, where anything moving outside could pass unseen. Ethan was half awake when it happened. Shadow's body went rigid at the foot of the bed, every muscle locking at once. Then came the sound Ethan had heard only a handful of times in his life, a low, resonant howl pulled from deep in the dog's chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't aggression. It was an emergency signal, the highest alert in canine training, used only when something catastrophic was unfolding or about to. Ethan was on his feet instantly. He grabbed his jacket, boots already half on, as Shadow bolted toward the back door. The dog did not wait for permission. Rain blasted them the moment Ethan flung the door open, soaking them both in seconds. Thunder rolled overhead, but Shadow didn't flinch. His focus was locked on the abandoned house, his body angled forward with relentless purpose. "Easy," Ethan muttered, though his own pulse was racing. Shadow ignored him. The back door of the abandoned house stood exactly where Ethan had last seen it. Rusted metal, ivy clinging to the frame, lock thick and industrial. Shadow stopped short, hackles raised, then stepped aside just enough to give Ethan access. His eyes flicked once toward Ethan's face, then back to the door, a silent command. "Now." Ethan didn't hesitate. He wedged a crowbar into the rusted lock and applied steady pressure. The metal protested, shrieked softly, then gave way with a dull snap. Thunder masked the sound, and rain swallowed any echo. The door creaked open, releasing a breath of cold, stale air that smelled of damp concrete, mold, and something else beneath it. Human sweat, long soaked into fabric. The stairs descended steeply into darkness. Shadow went first. The basement was larger than Ethan expected, carved deep into the earth. The beam of his flashlight swept across bare concrete walls, exposed pipes, and stacks of scavenged supplies arranged with meticulous care. Empty water containers, canned food, batteries, a small solar charger wired into a makeshift system. This wasn't a squatter passing through. This was someone who had planned to survive. A shape moved in the far corner. "Don't come any closer," a voice rasped, thin but controlled. "I don't have anything left to lose." The man who emerged from the shadows was tall but painfully thin, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had been stronger once. He looked about 32, with dark hair grown too long and uneven, clinging to his forehead. His skin was pale, almost gray, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. A short, unkempt beard traced his jaw, emphasizing the hollows beneath his eyes. Those eyes, hazel, alert, frighteningly focused, never left Ethan's chest. His hands shook, but not with fear, with exhaustion. Ethan raised his free hand slowly, palm open. He didn't speak. He let Shadow do what Shadow did best. The German Shepherd stepped forward and stopped precisely between them. He did not bare his teeth. He did not growl. He simply stood there, broad and solid, a living wall. His head turned slightly, one eye on the man, one eye on Ethan. Body language unmistakable. No sudden moves, no violence. The man's gaze dropped to the dog, and something shifted. His shoulders sagged an inch. His breath stuttered. "You sent him first," the man whispered. "That means you're not here to shoot me." "I'm not," Ethan said quietly. The man swallowed hard, bracing one hand against the wall. "They always send someone first, to make sure I'm really here." Shadow took one deliberate step closer and sat. Perfect posture, calm, unthreatening. The man stared, then let out a broken laugh that dissolved into a cough. He bent forward, gasping, one hand clutching his ribs. Ethan moved fast, catching him before he collapsed. The man weighed almost nothing. They sat him against the wall, gave him water in small sips. Shadow lay down nearby, head on his paws, eyes never closing. When the man finally caught his breath, he looked up at Ethan again, studying his face with an intensity that bordered on clinical. "You're military," he said hoarsely. "Special operations. You don't flinch when the storm hits." Ethan didn't deny it. "My name is Caleb Wright," the man said. "Systems engineer, formerly." The word carried weight. Loss. Something severed. Caleb explained in fragments at first, stopping often to drink, to breathe. He had worked for a defense contractor on classified systems integration, weapons logistics, secure communications, the kind of work that lived in encrypted files and sealed rooms. 6 months ago, he had found discrepancies, data that didn't align, arms shipments rerouted, payments traced through shell companies, government signatures where none should exist. When he'd pushed back, quietly, his team began to disappear. "Car accidents," Caleb said. "Overdoses. One suicide." His jaw clenched. None of them were accidents. He ran. He took what data he could carry, encrypted and fragmented, scattered across devices and dead drops. He chose this place because no one else would. The rumors had been easy to feed. A light left on. A noise at night. Fear did the rest. "And you?" Ethan asked. "Why stay?" Caleb looked at Shadow, then back at Ethan. "Because running forever means dying tired. I needed somewhere no one would look." Shadow lifted his head at that, eyes steady. There was no tension in his body now. No warning. Only watchfulness. That was the rehook, though Ethan didn't name it as such. Shadow had decided. Not because he trusted Caleb, not because Caleb was harmless, but because the dog recognized something fundamental in the man's scent, posture, and voice. A living creature fleeing to survive, not advance. Shadow had smelled killers before. This wasn't that. Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle over him. He had come here to disappear. Instead, something buried had dragged him back into relevance. "You can't stay here forever," Ethan said. Caleb nodded. "I know, but I just need time. Long enough to get this out." Thunder boomed overhead, closer now, as if punctuating the truth of that statement. Rainwater trickled down the walls, pooling near the floor. The basement was a refuge, but it was not safe. Ethan looked at the door, then at Shadow. Shadow met his gaze and did not look away. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You'll stay hidden. No lights. No noise, unless it's an emergency." Caleb's eyes widened. "You're not turning me in?" Ethan shook his head. "Not tonight." Caleb closed his eyes briefly, something like relief cutting through the fear. "Thank you." Shadow rose and stepped closer to Caleb, sniffing once, then turning away to resume his position near the stairs. The message was clear. You are under watch. You are under protection. As Ethan climbed back up into the storm, rain soaking him to the bone, he realized the truth with a clarity that left no room for denial. The house wasn't haunted. It was sheltering a man the world had decided to erase, and Shadow had known it long before he did. The first sign that the world had remembered Caleb Wright came disguised as coincidence. Ethan noticed it on a gray morning while unloading supplies from his truck. A black SUV rolled slowly past the edge of town, its windows tinted too dark for a place where most people waved at passing cars. The license plate was from out of state, not unusual on its own, but the vehicle didn't stop at the diner, didn't slow near the gas station. It circled once, deliberately, then disappeared down the road leading toward the forest. Shadow watched it go, body perfectly still, ears angled forward. He did not bark. He did not growl. His silence was more unsettling than noise would have been. Ethan closed the truck bed and stood there longer than necessary, tracking the direction the SUV had taken. He told himself not to jump at shadows. He had done that before, back when every unknown vehicle had meant possible contact. But this wasn't instinct alone. This was pattern recognition. The same quiet alarm that had kept him alive overseas whispered now at the edge of his awareness. By noon, the town felt different. At the diner, two men sat at the counter, nursing coffee they barely touched. Both were in their late 30s or early 40s, clean-cut in a way that felt intentional rather than casual. One had a square jaw with a neatly trimmed beard. The other, a narrow face and wire-frame glasses that didn't quite fit the rest of him. They spoke softly to the waitress, their manners polite to the point of discomfort, asking questions that sounded harmless until you listened closely. How long had the abandoned house been empty? Did anyone ever check on it? Strange things ever happen around here? The waitress shrugged them off with practiced indifference, but Ethan caught the way her shoulders tightened. People in small towns noticed tone more than words. Shadow lay at Ethan's feet, eyes half-lidded, but his attention never left the men. When one of them glanced down and met the dog's gaze, his smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before returning. Ethan filed that away. That evening, Caleb's encrypted laptop pulsed once, then went dark. Ethan had insisted the device remain powered down unless absolutely necessary, but even dormant, it was not invisible. Signals leaked. They always did. Whoever was looking had just realized the dead man wasn't as dead as they thought. Someone pinged the data, Ethan said quietly as he stood at the top of the basement stairs. Caleb looked up from the cot he'd been resting on, his face drawn but alert. That shouldn't be possible. I masked the fragments. Someone found a thread, Ethan replied. And they pulled. Caleb swallowed hard. Then they'll come. The logical choice was simple. Ethan could walk away. He owed Caleb nothing. He had come here to disappear, not to fight other people's battles. He could load Shadow into the truck and be across state lines before midnight. Shadow made the decision for him. When Ethan turned toward the back door, the German Shepherd did not follow. Instead, Shadow moved to the edge of the basement stairs and lay down across them, blocking the path with his body. He looked up at Ethan once, amber eyes steady and unblinking. He wasn't refusing a command. He was refusing abandonment. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, an old, familiar weight. He knelt and rested his hand on Shadow's neck, fingers pressing into the thick fur there. You chose, he murmured. Shadow did not move. That night, the phone signal in Ethan's house flickered. Calls dropped mid-ring. Data stalled. The forest remained quiet, but the quiet felt watched. From the porch, Ethan could see faint movement near the abandoned house. Shadows that didn't belong to branches, light that came and went without pattern. He decided then that if the hunters were coming, they would find exactly what the rumors promised. Ethan began with light, using battery-powered lanterns and old wiring scavenged from the garage. He rigged the abandoned house so that dim, erratic glows appeared in different windows at irregular intervals. Never the same window twice, never for long, just enough to be seen, then vanish. To anyone watching, it looked like someone, or something, moving inside without purpose. Next came sound. Ethan set up small speakers in the basement and along the outer walls, programmed to emit low-frequency noises that traveled unpredictably through the structure. Footsteps where none should be. A door creaking open and closed. A dull thump from beneath the ground that echoed and distorted. Not loud, not obvious. The kind of sound that made the brain search for explanations it didn't want to find. Shadow watched it all with quiet approval. The dog became Ethan's early warning system. Shadow could detect movement long before Ethan's eyes or ears registered anything. When he froze, When his breathing changed, when his tail lowered just enough to signal focus, Ethan paid attention. They moved as a unit now, the way they had once moved on patrol. Silent, observant, never rushing. The rehook came 2 nights later. Ethan was in the abandoned house, adjusting one of the lanterns, when Shadow suddenly pressed against his leg, hard. Not a warning. A command to stop. Shadow's ears angled sharply toward the tree line. His nostrils flared. Then Ethan heard it. A soft crunch, not the careless step of a drunk or the wandering gait of wildlife. A deliberate footfall, measured and cautious, coming from the forest behind the property. Shadow did not growl. Instead, he turned his head slightly, eyes reflecting the lantern light, and looked directly at Ethan. The message was unmistakable. They're trained. Ethan extinguished the lantern and moved into Shadow, heart pounding not with fear, but recognition. Whoever was out there wasn't here to spook locals. They weren't afraid of rumors. They were professionals, moving carefully, testing the perimeter. The footfalls retreated as quietly as they had come, swallowed by rain and darkness. But the damage was done. The game had changed. By morning, 2 more SUVs appeared on the outskirts of town. One parked near the trailhead, another idled near the closed hardware store. No one approached Ethan directly. No one threatened. That was the point. Pressure without contact. Fear without fingerprints. Caleb watched from the basement monitor Ethan had set up, his face pale. They're narrowing it down. Ethan nodded. Let them. He spent the afternoon refining the psychological traps, a motion-activated light that flared suddenly, then died. A speaker that emitted a low, almost subsonic hum just long enough to unsettle, then cut out. Nothing that would hurt anyone, nothing that could be traced easily, just enough to amplify uncertainty. Shadow remained constant. When movement approached, he alerted. When nothing was there, he rested, conserving energy. The dog did not chase. He did not bluff. He observed. That evening, as rain returned, Ethan stood on the porch, watching the abandoned house glow faintly from within, lantern light flickering like something alive. The town believed in ghosts because ghosts were easier than the truth. Inside the basement, Caleb sat with his back against the wall, listening to the rain and the distant sounds Ethan had engineered. You didn't have to do this, he said quietly. Ethan didn't answer right away. He watched Shadow instead. The way the dog's gaze never left the dark, the way his body positioned itself instinctively between threat and shelter. I'm not a hero, Ethan said finally. But I don't walk away from people being hunted for telling the truth. Shadow's tail thumped once against the floor, slow and deliberate. Outside, the forest absorbed the night. Somewhere beyond the trees, the hunters recalibrated, uncertain now, forced to question what they thought they understood. The abandoned house had become something else entirely, not a place of fear, a place of resistance. And Shadow stood guard at its heart, steady as a compass, pointing always toward what mattered most. Night fell with unnatural speed, as if the forest itself wanted cover for what was coming. Clouds pressed low over the treetops, smothering moonlight, and the air grew heavy with the promise of rain that never quite arrived. The abandoned house stood dark and waiting, its warped silhouette hunched against the trees like a patient animal pretending to be dead. The hunters came just after midnight. They moved quietly, confidently, the way men did when they believed the odds were stacked in their favor. To them, this was not a battlefield. It was a cleanup. Caleb Wright was a paranoid engineer hiding from ghosts. Ethan Cross was an aging veteran living off old instincts. The house was a decaying structure filled with superstition, nothing more. That assumption was their first mistake. From his position inside the house, Ethan felt the shift before he saw it. Shadow, lying near the base of the stairs, lifted his head sharply. His breathing changed. Not faster, but tighter, controlled. Ethan didn't look at the windows. He trusted the dog more than his own eyes. 3. Ethan murmured under his breath. Shadow's ears flicked once. Agreement. The first man breached through the side window, glass muffled by a blanket taped in place days earlier. He landed silently, knees bent, weapon raised. He expected dust, rot, maybe the stench of mold. Instead, he was greeted by silence and darkness that felt intentional. The floor creaked under his weight, a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness. A second man followed, then a third. They fanned out, methodical, disciplined, professionals, just as Shadow had warned. They didn't know Ethan was already moving. Ethan did not confront them head-on. He never had. In combat, survival came from misdirection, not dominance. He slipped through the narrow interior hallways he'd memorized, timing his movements to the soft footfalls of the intruders. He triggered the first layer of deception, a sudden flare of light in the upstairs bedroom, bright and brief, followed by darkness. One of the men swore softly. Another shifted position, weapon tracking upward. Shadow took his cue. The German Shepherd darted across the room, nails skidding deliberately against the floor, then vanished through a side door. He did not bark. He did not growl. He let his movement speak. The sound of his passage echoed just enough to draw attention, then disappeared toward the rear of the house. Two of the men followed instinctively. They never saw Ethan slip past them in the opposite direction. Down in the basement, Caleb sat with his back against the wall, hands clenched tightly in his lap. He could hear everything: the creak of floorboards, the muted voices above, the low-frequency hum Ethan had engineered into the structure. Fear pressed against his ribs like a second heart. "This is my fault," Caleb whispered to no one. The house responded with a dull thump, reverberating through the concrete. The sound carried, distorted by the old pipes and hollow spaces. To the men above, it sounded like something shifting beneath their feet. "Basement," one of them said. "That's where he'll be." They descended cautiously. They didn't know the basement was not what it seemed. Decades earlier, during the Cold War, the property had been modified by a previous owner obsessed with fallout shelters. Ethan had found the blueprints buried in county records. A narrow emergency passage leading from the basement into the forest, long since forgotten. He'd cleared it quietly over the past 2 nights, never telling Caleb unless it became necessary. Now, it was necessary. "Move," Ethan whispered as he appeared at the foot of the stairs, placing a finger to his lips. Caleb didn't argue. He grabbed the small pack he kept ready and followed Ethan into the hidden passage, heart hammering, breath shallow. Shadow reappeared at their side, moving smoothly, guiding them through the narrow tunnel with confidence born of instinct. Behind them, the hunters reached the basement. The first man swept his flashlight across the room, frowning. "Clear." The second man stepped forward, and the floor shifted beneath his weight. It wasn't a trap designed to injure. Ethan had been careful. A reinforced panel tilted just enough to throw off balance, sending the man crashing into a stack of metal shelving. The noise rang out, sharp and unmistakable. "Contact!" someone shouted. Chaos followed. Ethan heard it all from the mouth of the tunnel: the shouted orders, the confusion, the uncertainty. He felt a surge of grim satisfaction. The house was doing what it was meant to do: confuse, delay, protect. That was when everything went wrong. A fourth man, the one Ethan hadn't accounted for, came in through the rear. He'd circled wide, bypassed the obvious entry points. Smart. He spotted movement near the tunnel entrance just as Caleb disappeared into the trees. He raised his weapon. Shadow reacted faster than thought. The German Shepherd launched himself from the shadows, a blur of muscle and intent. He struck the man's arm, knocking the barrel aside as a shot rang out, tearing into the night. The man stumbled backward, swearing, firing wildly. Shadow yelped. The sound cut through Ethan like a blade. Ethan turned, heart seizing, and saw Shadow hit the ground hard, rolling once before scrambling to his feet. Blood darkened the fur along his shoulder, spreading fast, but not catastrophic. The dog growled low, positioning himself between the shooter and the tunnel without hesitation. Ethan moved without thinking. He tackled the man from the side, driving him into the dirt, wrenching the weapon free. The fight was short, brutal, and silent. When it ended, the man lay unconscious, breathing hard but alive. Ethan dropped to his knees beside Shadow, hands already searching for the wound. The bullet had grazed muscle, tearing through flesh but missing bone. Shadow panted, eyes bright with pain but unbroken. "You're okay," Ethan whispered, though his voice shook. "You're okay." Shadow's tail thumped weakly once, as if to reassure him. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Someone in town must have heard the gunshot. The remaining hunters melted back into the forest, mission aborted, uncertainty gnawing at their confidence. Ethan knew this wasn't a victory. It was a warning. He had believed he could control the variables. He had believed preparation was enough. Shadow's blood soaked into his hands, warm and real, and with it came the truth he could no longer avoid. Every choice had a cost. As Ethan bound Shadow's wound and helped him stand, the weight of that realization settled deep in his chest. He had crossed a line tonight, not into heroism, not into violence, but into responsibility. The haunted house had become a fortress, and fortresses drew fire. Ethan stitched Shadow's wound by the dim light of a lantern, hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. The bullet had torn through muscle, clean enough to heal, but the pain showed in the dog's eyes. Shadow did not whine. He did not pull away. He endured with the quiet dignity that had defined him since the day Ethan first put a harness on his broad chest. When it was done, Ethan wrapped the shoulder carefully and rested his forehead against Shadow's neck, breathing in the familiar scent of fur and rain and iron. "I've got you," Ethan said softly. Shadow's tail moved once. Enough. By dawn, the truth was unavoidable. The hunters would return, smarter and angrier, and the house, fortress or not, could not withstand a prolonged siege. Ethan needed help, not from local law enforcement, not from anyone whose radio calls could be intercepted or whose curiosity could be weaponized. He needed someone who understood the rules of shadows. He needed Lucas Hale. Ethan made the call from a burner phone. Standing at the tree line where reception wavered but existed, Lucas answered on the third ring, his voice low and controlled, as if he'd been expecting it. They had last spoken years ago, after Afghanistan, after a night when Ethan had dragged Lucas from a collapsed structure with shrapnel in his leg and fire closing in behind them. Lucas had never forgotten the debt. "Ethan," Lucas said, "you don't call unless it's bad." "It's worse than bad," Ethan replied. "I've got a witness. He's alive, and people are trying to erase him." There was a pause on the line, brief but heavy. "Send me what you have. Don't move." Caleb watched from the basement as Ethan relayed instructions. The engineer looked thinner than ever, shadows carved deep under his eyes, but his hands moved with precision as he powered up the encrypted drives. He worked quickly, methodically, a man who had lived with fear long enough to know how to function inside it. As the data packets began transferring through a secure relay Lucas provided, Caleb's shoulders slumped in relief and terror in equal measure. "They'll see the traffic," Caleb said. "They'll know." "I know," Ethan replied. "That's the point." The rehook came not with gunfire, but with silence. Midway through the transfer, the forest went still. No birds, no wind. Even the distant hum of the highway seemed to fade. Shadow lifted his head from where he lay, bandaged, shoulder stiff, and rose unsteadily to his feet. He did not face the house. He faced the woods, Then he sat, perfect posture, eyes locked on a single point beyond the trees. His breathing slowed, measured, deliberate. This was not alarm. This was recognition. Ethan felt the hair on his arms lift. "They're close," he murmured. Shadow did not look back. Minutes later, headlights flared through the trees, low and controlled. 2 vehicles this time. Not the careless probing of before. This was containment. Ethan moved Caleb deeper into the tunnel, positioning him at the far exit where the forest thickened and the ground sloped toward a creek. Shadow took position near the house's rear. Weight shifted forward despite the pain in his shoulder. "You stay with me," Ethan told him. Shadow's ears flicked. He stayed. The confrontation came fast. One hunter approached openly, hands visible, voice calm. He was tall, lean, with close-cropped hair and a scar running from his left temple into his beard. His movements were economical, confident. A professional who believed control was inevitable. "Ethan Cross," the man called. "You don't want this to end badly." Ethan stepped into view, hands empty. "You already crossed that line." The man smiled faintly. "You're protecting a liability. He's not worth your dog." The words landed harder than the man could have known. Shadow growled, low and resonant, a sound that vibrated through the ground. The hunter's gaze flicked to the dog, assessing, calculating. That was his mistake. From the trees, Lucas Hale moved. Federal agents followed, emerging from concealment with weapons trained, voices sharp and authoritative. The hunters froze, hands rising slowly, disbelief etched across their faces. The game had shifted again. Caleb's data finished transferring as agents secured the scene. The hunters were disarmed, restrained, and led away under the gray light of early morning. No shots fired, no heroics, just the quiet collapse of a plan built on secrecy. Ethan didn't feel triumph. He felt empty. As Lucas approached, rain beginning again in a soft drizzle, Ethan noticed the lines on his face had deepened. Lucas was taller than Ethan, broader, with a calm presence that came from long years making impossible decisions. His hair had gone silver at the temples, his eyes steady but tired. "You did the right thing," Lucas said. Ethan looked down at Shadow, who stood beside him, breathing unevenly but unbroken. Blood stained the bandage, but it had slowed. "I almost didn't," Ethan admitted. Lucas followed his gaze. "He's a good dog." "He's more than that," Ethan replied. Later, when the agents had gone and the forest began to breathe again, Ethan sat on the porch with Shadow's head resting against his leg. The dog's eyes were half closed now, exhaustion finally winning. Ethan ran his fingers through the thick fur behind Shadow's ears, grounding himself in the simple reality of touch. He understood then what had been forming since the first night. Some beings were not meant to endure forever. They were meant to arrive at the precise moment when endurance mattered most. To stand in the gap, to hold the line long enough for truth to pass through. When the last vehicle disappeared down the road, Ethan felt no victory, only relief that settled into fear. The quiet, persistent fear of losing the one constant that had guided him through chaos. Shadow shifted, pressing closer. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the weight of the moment pass through him. Fate had forced the confrontation, and it had taken its toll. The truth did not arrive with sirens or headlines. It came quietly, the way most real reckonings did, filtering through official statements, sealed indictments, and the sudden absence of certain names from public records. Within weeks, the story that had once lived only in whispers began to surface in pieces that the town could no longer ignore. Caleb Wright was no longer a ghost. Under federal protection, his testimony unraveled a chain of contracts and shell companies that stretched far beyond the forested edge of the town. What had started as a single engineer questioning corrupted data turned into a broader exposure of illegal arms transfers and bribery buried deep inside bureaucratic systems designed to look untouchable. Investigators came and went, never announcing themselves, never lingering long enough to invite speculation. They stayed in rented rooms, asked careful questions, and left behind a silence that felt different from fear. This silence felt earned. The abandoned house was the first thing to change. County officials arrived one morning with clipboards and wary expressions, stepping gingerly onto the porch as if expecting it to protest their presence. They cataloged damage, noted the altered wiring, the basement modifications, the signs of long-term habitation. The rumors dissolved under inspection. No unexplained phenomena, no missing persons, no supernatural residue. Just an old house that had sheltered a man the world wanted erased. When word reached the town, reactions were subdued but sincere. People didn't apologize so much as recalibrate. They spoke of the house differently now, not with fear, but with something approaching respect. It was no longer the haunted place. It became that house by the trees, stripped of myth and returned to reality. Irene Holloway stood at her fence one afternoon, watching the officials load their trucks. Her silver hair caught the light, and her expression was thoughtful rather than surprised. "I figured it was something like that," she said when Ethan joined her. "Fear always hides behind stories, easier than facing the truth." Shadow lay at Ethan's feet, his bandaged shoulder healed but stiff. He lifted his head at Irene's voice, eyes softening. She reached down to scratch his chin, and he accepted the touch with quiet grace. Caleb left without ceremony. Ethan watched him go from the porch, the engineer thinner still but standing straighter now, shoulders squared under the weight of something lifted. Caleb didn't wave. He didn't look back. He walked toward the waiting vehicle with the measured steps of someone who understood that survival sometimes meant never returning to the place that saved you. Ethan stayed. He didn't give interviews. He declined recognition. When a federal liaison suggested his actions bordered on heroic, Ethan shook his head and changed the subject. He had not fought for justice. He had stood still long enough for truth to catch up. Life settled into a new rhythm. Ethan began working with Lucas Hale to consult on canine training programs designed for witness protection details. Nothing official at first, just advice, adjustments, teaching handlers how to read the small signs that preceded danger. Shadow accompanied him when he could, moving more slowly now, his once tireless energy tempered by age and injury. But his presence alone changed the room. Dogs leaned toward him. Handlers listened more closely. Shadow was not a mascot. He was a standard. As weeks turned into months, the house across the yard remained empty, but no longer avoided. The county cleared the brush, repaired the porch, replaced the broken windows. The structure stood straighter than before, as if relieved of the burden it had carried alone. Ethan found himself glancing at it less often. Its work was done. Shadow aged the way working dogs always did, gradually, with dignity. His stride shortened. His joints stiffened in the cold. But each night, without fail, he took his place on the porch. He lay facing the darkness beyond the trees, ears half raised, eyes scanning shadows that no longer carried immediate threat. Ethan joined him one evening as the sun sank low, painting the sky in muted gold and ash. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed on the highway, its sound fading quickly into nothing. "You're still on duty," Ethan said quietly. Shadow's tail moved once, slow and deliberate. Ethan sat beside him, boots resting on the edge of the porch, hands clasped loosely between his knees. He thought about the man he had been when he arrived here, angry, fractured, desperate to disappear. He thought about the nights at 217, the basement door, the moment Shadow had chosen to stay, when Ethan was ready to leave. He understood now that some choices were not made with words. They were made by staying still when everything inside you wanted to run. The house had been given its name back, but Ethan had found something he hadn't been looking for. Not redemption, not peace. Direction. Shadow leaned slightly into his leg, a familiar weight grounding him in the present. The dog's eyes followed the last light as it slipped behind the trees, vigilant but calm. No ghosts waited in that darkness now. Only the quiet continuation of life. Ethan rested his hand on Shadow's broad head, fingers tracing the familiar lines of scar and fur. "There are fates that don't choose men," he said softly, words meant for no one else. "They choose the ones who stand beside us when everyone turns away." Shadow did not answer. He didn't need to. The sun disappeared completely, leaving the porch in twilight. Together, man and dog watched the world settle, steady hearts anchored by silent paws, ready not for battle, but for whatever came next. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, disguised as loyalty, instinct, or a presence that refuses to leave your side when the world turns away. Maybe God doesn't always remove the darkness. Maybe he places someone or something beside us to help us walk through it. In our daily lives, we all face moments where the truth feels heavy, where standing still feels easier than standing up, where being forgotten seems safer than being seen. And yet, again and again, grace finds its way through the smallest cracks, through a faithful companion, through a choice to stay, through courage that doesn't shout, but endures. If this story touched something in your heart, share it with someone who might need it today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, or what part of the story stayed with you the longest. And if you believe in stories that remind us of loyalty, faith, and quiet strength, consider subscribing to Silent Paws Steady Hearts. May God bless you, protect you, and place the right companions in your life when you need them most. And may you never walk through your darkest nights alone. Until next time.